last Caherly, and I just want to begin with absolutely no disrespect to the Minister. He's very welcome to the House, and I appreciate his time in coming. And while acknowledging it's a busy time for the Government, I am somewhat disappointed, as I no doubt all of those interested in this case will be, that the Government didn't feel it appropriate to send a more senior Minister for this debate, given its significance. But I'll move on from that. Caherlack, let me first of all begin by welcoming Liam Shannon to the Seanad here today. Liam is here on behalf of the group who are known as the Hooded Men. The men, 14 in all, are so known because they were selected by the British and Unionist governments for special attention. They were separated out, isolated from several hundred other men who, like them, were arrested in swoops in the days and weeks after internment was introduced in the North in August 1971. That special attention led to these 14 men experiencing a horrendous time at a secret location which we now know to be Ballykelly Army Barracks, tortured by highly trained members of the British Crown Forces, who, despite the passage of time, almost 50 years, remain unknown to these 14 men. Their identity remains protected by the British Government, on whose behalf they practised their nefarious deeds on the men, defenceless and in captivity. For nearly 50 years, these men have been on a mission for truth and justice for themselves, their families and for humanity itself. 4 of the 14 men have died during this time, and our solidarity and support is with their families today. The remainder continue in their quest for justice, and it's a quest that began in August 1971, in dark, despairing and a dangerous dungeon where these men, individually and separately, were hooded and handcuffed to a radiator and systematically and ruthlessly interrogated beyond the point of exhaustion over a 7 to 10 day period. These vulnerable men were cruelly and grievously injured, physically and psychologically, by their captors. The full resources of the British state were used to try to crush the will of these 14 men. They were guinea pigs in a torture experiment which the British Government had used in other colonies and on other defenceless and captured prisoners. The methods deployed on Irish citizens are still followed to this very day, the ABCs of torture carried out throughout the world still. The toolkit of the torturer was multi-layered. The first and most essential part of the torturer's toolkit was the knowledge that what he was doing had the approval of the British and Unionist governments, and that he had immunity from prosecution or accountability for his cruel behaviour. The second part was the knowledge that the torturer was trained in his dark arts by the British Ministry of Defence and was well paid for his services. The toolkit also included the torturer's menu, the infamous 5 techniques. When combined, these techniques subjected the men to so-called deep interrogation. These techniques were meticulously refined to have maximum impact on the helpless individual being experimented on. But for the techniques to work effectively, the men had to be in a state of fear and uncertainty. They were violently arrested from their homes by the British Crown Forces. They were taken by helicopter, hooded to an unknown destination where silence and isolation reigned. They were stripped of their clothes and personal belongings and forced to wear a boiler suit and hood. As Francie McGuigan told us at the recent briefing here in Leinster House, at times they were stripped and photographed, their torturers holding their brutalised bodies up by the hair, another form of so-called degrading treatment, just like in Guantanamo, just like in Abu Ghraib, just like in Palestine. The torturer's handbook followed meticulously even to this very day. One of the most noted stories of torture endured by the hooded men was when they were hooded. They were brought from the specially designed torture chamber at Ballykelly to a helicopter and flown for a prolonged period, but just several, 4 or 5 feet in the air. And while hooded, they were thrown out backwards from that helicopter, thinking they were God knows high up. The psychology behind all of this was to deprive the men of their normal, everyday sensory experience of life. The boiler suit and the hood over their heads covered their naked bodies. For over a week, they lived in their boiler suits and performed all bodily functions. The hood was only removed during interrogations. The 5 techniques included prolonged periods of standing against the wall, arms and legs spread-eagled, the so-called stress position, hooded day and night, deprivation of sleep by using what the men described as high-pitched hissing noise, and deprivation of food and drink. During the briefing in Leinster House recently, we were told it was like the noise went in through your head and penetrated every sinew and muscle in your body. It went down into your lungs and came out through your toes. The men were repeatedly and viciously beaten about the head and had their genitals kicked and continuously threatened with death. The effect of this was prolonged pain, physical and mental exhaustion, severe anxiety, depression, hallucinations, disorientation and repeated loss of consciousness. Having listened to the men's story, I would contest too that not only were they subjected to torture over this period, but so too were their families. These men were taken from their homes and their people, their mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, wives and girlfriends, all of whom knew nothing of their whereabouts the whole duration of their torture. Families crippled with fear, unbeknownst to them where their loved ones were taken. So they went to hospitals, they even went to mortuaries. Their fathers went and pleaded with the RUC, who told them they hadn't got them. But we know they had them. They had them in Ballykelly Barracks. All this done at a time when sectarian killings were rife, when young men were being lifted off the streets to meet the most cruelest of ends. Now, can you only imagine the worry for their families, the torture for their families, when the very people who arrested them without trial were then telling their loved ones that they were gone, that they didn't have them? And what happened to them, ultimately, at the end of this prolonged period of torture? No wraparound care, no after services, no counselling, but in the Donnghaile internment camp they went, arrested and held without trial or without charge. So the entirety and the magnitude of all these frightening ordeals continue to haunt these men to this very day. The most reasonable people know what these men experienced, in a word, was torture. Yet the reason why Liam is with us today is because the European Court of Human Rights has decided that the men weren't in fact tortured. They are here because the court has a different threshold when defining torture, and what I have just described to the House, believe it or not, according to the court, isn't torture. However, the court readily accepts that what the men experienced was inhuman and degrading treatment, and we would all agree on that, of course. But I, like I'm sure many colleagues, am baffled. Indeed, most sensible people would be baffled as to the actual legal difference between inhumane torture and degrading treatment. Between torture and inhumane and degrading treatment. What is the difference? I don't believe there is any difference. Human rights organisations around the world don't believe there's none. The Irish state believes there's none, and that's why it has taken Britain to the European courts twice since 1971. In 1971, the Irish government, on the men's behalf, took the British state to the European Court of Human Rights, the European Human Rights Commission. The Commission found the British government guilty of torturing the men, unanimously. The British government appealed that decision, and in 1978, the European Court of Human Rights reversed the Commission's verdict and found the British government guilty of inhuman and degrading treatment and not torture. And so here we are today. But under international pressure, the British government announced it would never again use the 5 techniques on defenceless prisoners. In December 2014, the Irish government, following renewed efforts by the men and their families, took the British government to the Court of Human Rights on the basis of new facts to seek to overturn the 1978 verdict and reinstate the Commission's verdict of torture. In March of this year, the European Court upheld its 1978 decision that the British government used inhuman and degrading treatment and not in fact torture. And tonight, Catherlock, I'm asking the Seanad to support this motion, calling on the Irish Government to appeal the decision earlier this year and to continue the good work the state began in 1971. And time's quickly running out to lodge this appeal. And it's a straightforward matter, and the Government should act swiftly. The men, and indeed society here in Ireland and across the world, need the Irish Government and are looking to the Irish Government to pursue justice for the men until it is ultimately achieved. Such persistence sends a very clear message to those governments who continue to use inhuman and degrading torture that their actions are being scrutinised and they will be made accountable for them. Francie McGuigan put it very succinctly when at the briefing just 2 weeks ago he told us, "Our ask is simple. The British government should wear the label of torturer on the international stage because that is exactly what they were. There should be no legal or popular tolerance of torture, no matter the circumstances, and human rights courts need to be crystal clear on this fundamental issue." When the Hoded men came to Leinster House, they moved us with their story. They insisted that this isn't a political issue. They stressed further it certainly isn't a party political issue, and they told us this is an issue of human rights. Their lawyer, Dara Magan, added, "The Irish state took this case because they knew the truth of what these men endured." Why would you set out on this legal journey to not see it through to the very end? I agree with all of those sentiments, as I have no doubt the rest of this Seanad does too. And Minister, it's important to say, because sometimes, regardless of its significance, the term legacy case has almost lost its edge. It's lost its importance because there is such a litany and so many experiences from the course of the conflict. But this isn't just a legacy case. This has live, immediate, lived consequences for these men and their families. It has live legal implications for victims of torture all around the world, while states continue to use the verdict in relation to this case as some kind of cloak of convenience or cover for the torture that they inflict on citizens, whether their own or indeed from other countries. In fact, the book written by Father Fall and Monsignor Murray in 1975 on the experience of the Hooded men continues to sell all around the world right to this day. Such a sad reflection on the interest in this case and the example being looked to by victims of torture all around the world in the form of the Hooded men and their campaign. So I would urge you, Minister, on behalf of the Government, to tell us that this appeal will be lodged and that the Irish state won't just stand for the Hooded men, but will stand for victims of torture all around the world, and will stand, more importantly, for any further potential victims of torture, so that we can shine a light and expose what happened to the Hooded men, and that this state will set an example across the EU and beyond that we stand for justice and for truth.
Thank you.
The prevention and the eradication of torture and other forms of cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment has been a cornerstone of Ireland's approach to human rights for decades. And we are rightly seen across the world as a defender of the international human rights framework, including through our work in the EU and in international fora such as the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, the Council of Europe and the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The case taken by Ireland against the UK in 1971 broke new ground in the international protection of human rights, and as the first interstate case to be brought before the European Court of Human Rights, Ireland versus UK showed that all states that signed up to international agreements on human rights could and should be held accountable. And that's a principle we stand by today. Then, on the 2nd of December 2014, the Government announced its decision to request the European Court of Human Rights to revise its 1978 judgment in the case taken by Ireland against the UK, and on the basis of new material uncovered, the Government contended that the ill treatment suffered by 14 men in Northern Ireland in 1971 should be recognised as torture. The Court's judgment, as we all know, was delivered on the 20th of March. The Court refused the Government's application to revise the 1978 judgment and find that the men had suffered torture, and the refusal was made on two grounds. Firstly, the Court didn't believe that the new documents contained a sufficient prima facie case that one of the witnesses had misled the Commission and the Court about the long-term effects of the 5 techniques of interrogation. Secondly, the Court did not accept that even if Dr. Lay had given misleading evidence, it might have had a decisive influence on the Court's finding in the original judgment. The men who suffer this treatment have understandably been very disappointed by the Court's decision. 4 decades have gone by since the case was first decided by the Court, and the men have shown great courage and great dignity in continuing to seek to have their treatment recognised as torture. My colleague, the Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, met the men recently to hear of their experiences, and I know from speaking to him that he was deeply moved by what they told him on that day. And I want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the fortitude, to the persistence of the men who became known around the world as the Hooded men. They have had to deal with the long-lasting effects of this treatment, and my thoughts are with them this evening. It is important to remember that nothing in the judgment of the 20th of March changes the finding that the men suffered inhuman and degrading treatment in breach of their rights under Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Nor does it mean that this treatment is not, by current standards, torture. The revision procedure is about looking again at the case as it was at the time and considering whether the new information would have changed the Court's decision at the time of the original judgment. In this case, the Court decided that it would not have changed the original judgment. and I know that many people are eager that the Government should seek a referral of the revision application to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights. And while this is possible, it is important to note that there is no automatic right for such a referral. Any application to have the case referred to the Grand Chamber would first be considered by a panel of 5 judges, and no application to refer a revision request to the Grand Chamber has ever been successful. I want to be clear that the Government has not ruled out making such an application, but this is a decision we will not take lightly. The Government has 3 months from the date of the decision to apply for a referral, and we are using that time to consider the judgment very carefully before any Cabinet decision on whether to move ahead with the application. When the Government has made a decision on whether to apply for a referral to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights, that decision will be made public. Cathaoirleach, in closing, I want to assure the men whose treatment led Ireland to take this case in 1971, and all of those who have campaigned with them in the decades since, that the Government regards this case with the utmost seriousness. That is why we will consider the judgment of the 20th of March very, very carefully before reaching a decision based on the information and the advice that we have.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Niall, in 5 minutes.
I'll ask Cathaoirleach and Minister, thank you for your contribution to what is a very significant and important debate, given all that has been said by members across the Seanad floor tonight. And I want to thank all of the members for their contributions, and indeed, Minister, thank you for being here. I also want to, in particular, note the broad range of signatories to this motion before us for discussion as well. I also note that when the men were down, we had 5 of the hooded men down to do the briefing in the AV room, and they were down on that day also to meet with Taoiseach, and I thank the Taoiseach for taking the time to meet him. I have no doubt he appreciates the nuances and the global, as other colleagues have said, significance of the judgment, how it is, I suppose, utilised, for want of a better term. I would say how it is abused by other states around the world, and also the significance and importance as to the reasons why this appeal is so fundamentally important. And I wanted to take the opportunity, while we were here, Minister, and while I have the floor afforded to me, just to read into the record of this House the names of the 14 hooded men: Jim Auld, Pat Shivers, Joe Clark, Michael Donnghaile, Kevin Hanaway, Holly Joe McLean, Francie McGuigan, Patrick McNally, Sean McKenna, Jerry Kerr, Michael Montgomery, Davy Rogers, Brian Turley and Liam Shannon, who's with us tonight. And behind each and every single one of them men is a family, is a lived experience of that awful time, but also a lived experience of the legacy of the torture that they and so many people around them endured in those much darker days of our conflict here in Ireland. And I made the point earlier, so I won't rehearse it, that sometimes legacy cases and legacy issues almost lose their edge, they lose their pointedness. But this is a lived experience. Legacy is a lived experience, not just for these men, but for all of those who have been affected right across the board, and Senator Norris noted it. There has been many people hurt and affected by the conflict, and we want to see a scenario and a situation where all of those people have access to truth and have access to justice moving forward, because it is the most modest and most basic requirement of any democracy, of anyone who believes in and upholds the process of natural law and natural justice going forward. So, Minister, I want to put on the record that I won't, because of the undisputable and very welcome cross-party and unanimous support for this motion, I won't be pushing it to a vote. But you have said, in terms of your summing up there, Minister, that the Government is carefully considering this. They should, because it is that important, and I wish them well in their deliberations, and I hope that they know that when they are dealing with the hooded men, and when they're dealing with their families, these men have campaigned for 50 years. These men have been to every court, not just in this land, but beyond. These men endure. These men suffered the horrific, horrible torture that we have outlined And we can't do credit or do service to the way that they can outline their experiences, and that's why the briefing and the meeting with the Taoiseach was so important. These men will continue to campaign, and they have our full support, they have our full endorsement, they have our full solidarity, and they have our full best wishes in the sure and certain knowledge that we all know in this House that those men were tortured. And all they ask, and other colleagues have said why it's so important, is that that is rightly recognised for what it was. I said it in my earlier contribution. Francie McGuigan, one of the hooded men, very simply, it really affected me, it really hit me during the course of the briefing. He says the British should wear the label of torture on the international stage, because that is what they were. So, Seanad,
Thank you very much, Senator. Now, the question is, well, it's not. I think the motion is agreed to. Is the motion agreed to? Agreed. Agreed. Thank you all. And thank you, Minister.